We will begin with Dr. Iryna Yakovenko, who is going to be talking about Flannery O'Connor as a cartoonist. Iryna is teaching. She's associate professor of philology at Chernihiv National Pedagogical Faculty in Ukraine, and she has written on American literary history, as well as on, from what I can see, the connections between law and literature. So the floor is to Iryna.
Well, thank you. Flannery O'Connor is one of the greatest American writers of the second half of the 20th century. The writer in the southern tradition of Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, and Carson McCullers, who is as well known for her tantalizing brand of Southern Gothic humor as she is for her Catholicism. That these tendencies should be combined in her fiction is no longer a surprise. The real surprise is learning that this classic writer of American literature didn't set out to be a fiction writer, but a cartoonist. And this seems to be the last well-kept secret of her creative life. And just... The quote is, I'd like to quote, "Aspects of O'Connor's personality and interests are evident in her early visual work. Like her fiction, her cartoons demonstrate her ability to illuminate the absurdities of social convention or of simple everyday life with combination of seriousness and humor." Flannery O'Connor is renowned for her two novels, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away, and two books of short stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find and Everything That Rises Must Converge. She's also the author of several essays, I'll name only some of them, like Some Aspects of the Grotesque in the Southern Fiction, The Church and the Fiction Writer, and The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South. According to Wendy, O'Connor's fictional world is a severe, hilarious, violent place. People behave with senseless intolerance, not just racial intolerance, which we might expect of the South in the middle of the 20th century, but also a deep-seated prejudice against anything or anyone from elsewhere, and particularly from Europe, the source of unreformed religion, gibberish-like speech, and other undesirable forms of behavior, end of quote. Let's go back. And what molded such a bizarre fictional world? What factors formed the writer's vision? The first is that she was the descendant of the family bound up with a Southern history, but traditional Southern manners and modes, its ethos, was satirized in her fiction as insufficient and obsolete. The second important aspect is her Catholic faith. She was inspired and found guidance in the scripture and the writings of Aquinas, also philosophers and theologians of the Catholic revival at mid-century, like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Etienne Gilson. As writer, she was interpreting life and society from the subject position of a Catholic who lived in a large Protestant culture and created non-didactic Christian fiction. Another biographic fact worth mentioning is that Flannery O'Connor suffered from terminal illness, and her illness added a lot to the character of her religiosity, and such religiosity gave her fiction its greater power. She had a clear sense that her personal limitations and the discipline they entailed somehow fostered sharper vision. She would see in her own illness a metaphor for the condition of her age, and would connect it with the disorientation and displacement of 20th century humanity, and more particularly of the contemporary Southerner. Sally Fitzgerald, her biographer, wrote on O'Connor's acceptance of her disease and the spiritual growth that ensued as the response to a call of the deeper sort of vocation. We cannot overlook the fact that O'Connor spent a brief but significant portion of her adulthood in New York City, which left her with a lingering sense of the dislocation of 20th century urban life. Her experiences with urban life proved disorienting enough to the displaced Southerners to suggest the larger metaphors for homeliness and that pervade her fiction. Flannery O'Connor matured in the time when World War II and its aftermath changed the civilization forever, thus witnessing that European theologians call the end of the modern world. As O'Connor reflected in The Habit of Being, quote, "The novelist with the Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and this problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural, and he may be forced to take even more violent means to get its vision across to this hostile audience. When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. But when you have to assume it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock." And she continues, "I use the grotesque the way I do because people are deaf and dumb and need help to see and hear." Flannery O'Connor's prose is vividly marked by the grotesque. The origins of O'Connor's fascination with the grotesque can be found in her cartooning, which started in high school in 1941 and continued up to 1945. At the University of Iowa, her first courses were courses in advanced drawing. She hoped to be able to support her writing by selling cartoons to national publications. Flannery O'Connor, however, was unable to sell any of her cartoons, at which time she began devoting all her energy to writing. Her cartoons were published in the Peabody Palladium, the student newspaper at O'Connor's High School, in 1941, in the newspaper of the Georgia State College for Women, the Colonnade, and in the college yearbook, the Spectrum. In the year 2011, the book Flannery O'Connor, The Cartoons, was released by Fantagraphics. It compiles all of the existing cartoons that O'Connor created for her high school and college publications in the 1940s when she was an avid cartoonist. Many of O'Connor's published cartoons were linoleum block prints. Linoleum block printing involves cutting or etching an image onto a linoleum sheet. In O'Connor's case, she attached the linoleum to a piece of wood, applied a solid color ink to the linoleum cutting, and printed the image onto a piece of paper. The image was then printed in black and white in the final publication. She also was cartooning in a more conventional tradition, just an ink, paper technique instead of linocut. But her style is distinctive. The charmingly brusque drawings are cut from linoleum and then essentially stamped when she applied ink to the ridges. And while the content is largely related to her experience as a student, one can still feel the perspective that appears in O'Connor's short stories. And Kelly Gerald characterized the cartooning manner of O'Connor in such a way, quote, "Her cartoons are a creative thrashing floor for experimenting and trying out techniques that are deployed later with such great success in her fiction. O'Connor learns how to set up and carry a joke visually, how to write a good one-liner and set it off against a background of complex visual narration. She develops and asserts her taste for a stock set of character types, attitudes, situations, exaggerations, and grotesques, and she learns how to present them not to distort the truth, but to expose her vision of it," end of quote. And just the cartoons, some of the cartoons by Flannery O'Connor, we can have a look at the first one. I tried to preserve the captions, but actually we can see that the caption says, "These two express the universal feeling of brokenness over school closing." And we have got this happy two, and just another popular type in the cartoon of O'Connor, just the student, a very ambitious female student. And just again, very understand, I got nothing against getting educated, but it just looks like there ought to be an easier way to do it. Well, and just again, just this marvelous student admiring whether they have any books the faculty doesn't particularly recommend. And just now comes spring fever. Well, and these two, just the first one, she says we are on the threshold of social revolution. Yeah, and just the second one, just I understand it's a physic maladjustment created by a marked dissatisfaction with a change in environment wherein the family unit is disrupted, called homesickness. And just very interesting one, just the first one says, okay, well, I can always be a PhD, and you don't mind if I get comfortable, do you? Wake me up in time to clap. And the second one, I omitted the caption, but it seems to me we can improvise to some extent. But actually the original caption is, do you think teachers are necessary? Really? And it breaks my heart to live for a whole summer, really. Are you glad to be back? And the marching women or girls. And the first one, the caption is, targets are where you find them. And I think it's perfectly idiotic to the Navy not to let your waves dress sensibly like us college girls. And the third one is very brief, traffic. And here she depicts the immediate results of Physical Fitness Day. And this cartoon was accidentally published without a caption, and no record of what O'Connor intended for it has survived. And just one more, and the final one here. Yeah, I know it's a nice shoe, lady, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. And actually, O'Connor's cartoons depict humorous views of life on campus, including school performances, social activities, studying, and life on campus with the waves. Flannery O'Connor satirizes and criticizes the women accepted for voluntary service waves. It's emergency service, which was created during the Second World War. And these waves were stationed at Georgia State College for Women when the US Navy designated the campus as a site for training. And she criticizes this organization and the girls for their nonconformity, their disruption of the male-female ratios in Milledgeville. Also, she criticizes students and faculty for their apathy, the educational establishment in general for its promulgation of weak-mindedness, pretentiousness of the area's aristocracy, and herself. In several of her cartoons, she pokes fun at herself, as in the one which portrays a social situation in which everyone is dancing except for a bespectacled wallflower who gains behind her hand and asserts that she can always pursue a PhD. What imagery, ideas, and style elements are presented in Flannery O'Connor's fiction? Life in the cartoons performed in abrupt and harsh lines. In her fiction, the characters are depicted as ugly, unsympathetic human beings, often with physical or mental deformities. O'Connor amasses the distortions, focusing on the illogical and absurd actions and behavior of the characters, thus creating textual caricatures full of paradoxes and black humor. Her literary works are populated by physically and morally ugly, off-putting creatures like corrupt preachers, false prophets, congenial morons, cruel parents, madmen, women, self-hatred of their feminine nature. The men-like uniformed marching girls from O'Connor's cartoons will be later reproduced in her prose as characters deprived of femininity or self-sufficient in their preoccupation with philosophy or variance, like Joy Halgar, a PhD philosopher, a physically disabled person who feels intellectually superior but is paradoxically cheated by the Bible salesman who steals her eyeglasses and her wooden leg, thus ruining her superiority. The figures of intellectuals like Halga or Reiber from The Violent Bear It Away represent O'Connor's distrust in progress, enlightenment, and modern man's advancement. The writer employs the repeated references to watching, eyes, eyeglasses, and inner vision, stressing the idea of looking and not seeing. Such characters like Mrs. Hopewell from Good Country People, Grandmother, A Good Man is Hard to Find, are the caricaturic images of genteel, good Christian women deprived of any Christian virtues. Julian's mother, from Everything That Rises Must Converge, is the incarnation of white supremacy, while Julian demonstrates intellectual and artistic superiority. The misfit, from A Good Man is Hard to Find, represents the fundamentalistic imperative. In her prose, O'Connor brings up the issues of Christian faith by lampooning Baptist ceremonies. She also mocks hypocrisy, self-righteousness, race or intellectual superiority by focusing on absurd actions, clumsy gestures of her fictional characters, thus by physical distortions underlying their spiritual clumsiness. As for the most characteristic elements in O'Connor's prose, we can mention the following, like grotesque hyperbole, narrative detachment, ambiguity, deformity and grotesque violation, distortions, comic shock in the sharpness of the story's punchline, the unexpectedness of the climactic reversal. She puts great emphasis on the appearance of the characters. She addresses animal imagery, while describing human beings, like hyena, sheep, crab, whizzing horse. O'Connor de-emphasizes the importance of individuals through naming techniques and an avoidance of names altogether. And also she uses telltale names like Mr. Fortune, J. Hopewell, who's neither joyful nor hopeful, and Mrs. Cope, Bishop, etc. So we can assume that O'Connor's grotesque imagery, sharp wit, irony, and sarcasm, primarily employed in the author's graphic works, then were developed into even wider scope of literary techniques in her fiction. Some of the key themes and motives from O'Connor's fiction, like displacement and homesickness, human vices, superiority, conformity, intolerance, were first presented in her graphic art primarily and then evolved in her fiction. Thank you very much.
And our next speaker is Carolyn Stuart, who is based in Los Angeles and has been teaching American art history. She received her PhD in art history from UCLA, working on the art and the writings of Stuart Davis in relation to changing perceptions of the landscape. And she's currently working on the way visual culture conveys meanings and constructs ideas about gender, race, and ethnicity. Hence, I assume today's talk, Generations of Feminist Intelligentsia, June Wayne, Gilah, Yelin, Hirsch, Jones of Art.
My title, Generations of Feminist Intelligentsia, June Wayne and Gilah, Yelin, Hirsch. So I start with a section, Off to Battle. Joan of Arc disguised herself as a man so that she could lead troops during the 100 Years' War. She concealed her true identity, as was socially perceived, so that she could pursue what she was compelled to do, to follow the visions of saints and reverse what was widely considered an inevitable loss. Joan of Arc was illiterate, yet articulate. Letters she dictated to use to stay her execution evidence the indispensable role her intellect played in negotiating through multiple obstacles. Thus, it seems that when Gilah, Yelin, Hirsch dubbed seminars initiated by June Wayne to help women artists become professionals, and she dubbed them the Joan of Art series, Hirsch recognized that to survive as a woman artist was a battle, and it took courage and skill. Later, the seminars would include men and were renamed the Joan and John of Art series. And I even corrected that in the type too, and I still said it wrong. Wayne's and Hirsch's contributions as writers and intellects are as significant as their contributions as artists. Hirsch described that she first met the mind of June Wayne, quote, by ear, before she was invited to join the Joan of Arc seminar. In 1970, Hirsch was a newly minted MFA working in Santa Monica studio and heard Wayne on the radio. She was, quote, dazzled by eloquence and arrested by conviction, stunned by the courage of the content, unquote. Afterwards, Hirsch says that her life changed. Wayne, the orator on the radio, was a woman, and she was, quote, decrying the fact that women artists were not recognized, unquote. According to June Wayne, both men and women artists were stereotyped as female and essentially disenfranchised. In her essay, quote, the essay titled The Male Artist as Stereotypical Female, published in Art Journal in 1973, Wayne explained that the feminized stereotype gave the impression that an artist was incapable of dealing with the real world of money. It was profitable for the art professionals to keep the artist disenfranchised, on a pedestal, waiting for others to cope on his or her behalf. However, as Wayne later wrote in an essay, men could, and often did, camouflage their femininity in a macho, motorcycle-riding persona, the persona of a person who, quote, popped drugs, not iron supplements, unquote. Remarkably, under the pressures of a male-centric art world, Hirsch and mentor June Wayne never concealed their artistic personas in the cloak of a feminized stereotype, as did so many men. Quite the opposite, in fact, as Wayne secured funding from the Ford Foundation to start a program to revive the art of lithography in the United States. And she established this program called the Tamarind Lithography Workshop, for which she may be most well known, but which will not be the focus of my paper today. The lithography workshop extended from a 1-year to a 10-year program before becoming a permanent institute at the University of New Mexico. When Wayne founded the Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles, it was against formidable pressures of the East Coast art establishment. This is not to say that Wayne never felt that it was more difficult to succeed as a woman in the art world. She found humor, though, in her 90s in the way that her look, as you can see in this photo, was transformed by cancer treatments that resulted in weight loss and a boyish short haircut, because now she looked less like a suburban housewife. Several times she told me that people in the art world seem to take her more seriously now. Part 1, lifelong literati. This is what Wayne looked like in 2010 when I began conducting an oral history of her for UCLA Center for Oral History Research. She was almost always wearing a large magnifying glass around her neck, a handy tool for someone whose scrutiny covered everything from the details of her lithographic stone to what she called the ecology of the art world. She always approached the world with curiosity and pursued answers to satisfy it. Her artistic career spanned 88 of her 93 years. That is, if one considers her revelation at 5 years old, which she documented in her authorized chronology of her life. At 5 years old, she noted that the forms in comic strips were composed of many small dots of different colors, and that she began to paint and draw in colored dots, or Ben-Day dots. She was an autodidact and consumed literature voraciously. As a young girl, she got off the school bus early at the Chicago Public Library and spent days reading there instead of attending school. Before her 10th birthday, she began painting an illuminated manuscript of the poetry of Omar Khayyam, and by the age of 15 decided she would be an artist. So the arts and literature and the visual arts were closely intertwined for Wayne from an early age. Gilah, Yelin Hirsch, grew up in an intellectual household with a father who she describes as a brilliant scholar and a mother who became a renowned Canadian author of literature and poetry. Her own childhood career plans were to become a writer and psychologist, which she did in many ways, in addition to becoming an artist, as we'll see. At a mere 10 years of age, she wrote to Albert Einstein, whom she queried about how to reconcile his life as a scientist with his belief in God. His reply, received a week later and just a few months before his death, became a guiding mantra for her life. Einstein told Hirsch to, quote, try to form your opinions according always to your own judgment, unquote. This letter hangs framed in her Venice home today. Part 2. The conundrum of artist is art as intellect. In addition to thinking about Wayne and Hirsch as artist intellectuals, I'd like you to consider additional ways of conceiving their works and their creative process, terms each of these women used to conceptualize what they do. Wayne compared artists to carpenters, and Hirsch compared an artist's work to that of scientists. For Wayne, to say that artists are like master carpenters might seem at first to be a contradiction of her own dictum, articulated in her article, Male Artist is Stereotypical Female. In it, she wrote, the shape of the art scene today, the shape of the art scene of the future depends on how profoundly, how philosophically, and yes, how cerebrally, which she italicized, artists come to understand themselves. The shape of the art scene of the future depends on how profoundly, how philosophically, and yes, how cerebrally artists come to understand themselves. However, when it came to getting the work of art done, as an artist, Wayne wrote in an essay entitled The Creative Process. Oh, it was already on there. Okay, not the right file. The Creative Process, Artists, Carpenters, and the Flat Earth Society. She said, Wayne said, she simply liked to get to work, knew what her own skills were, just as a master carpenter does, and considered her creative process an industrial secret. So why should she give that to her competition? With her typical humor. Her essay revealed savvy about the potential manipulation of artists, whether it was to someone else's corporate or commercial benefit, or whether it was to a government controlling the forms of artist expression to serve its own ends. When Wayne compared herself to a master carpenter, she did not mean that she was any less intellectual about her work. It just meant that her work materialized only because she had the skills that she applied. And here I'd like to briefly remind you of John Singleton Copley's portrait of Paul Revere, a silversmith from 1771, because this shows just how far back artists in the United States sought to make people realize that painting and other art forms required a great deal of intellect. Perhaps it has been sociocultural baggage inherited from the colonial era that American artists in particular have had to fight to be valued by society. In Copley's depiction of Revere, there is a gleam of light on Revere's forehead that connects on a diagonal axis across to his hand, which is clutching his chin, through the light, reflecting on the silver pot he holds in his left hand with its dirty fingernails. Copley thus shows a man in his working clothes, not putting on any airs, with the signs of his labor visible in his fingernails, and yet the brilliance of the object cannot be disconnected with the light on his forehead. Thus, the craft of making art, its labor, does not preclude, and perhaps Copley is saying, it relies on and is inseparable from the intellect. Such perceptions of artists as mere craftsmen or even as conjurers prevailed for centuries. As June Wayne pointed out in her essay entitled The Creative Process, Artists, Carpenters, and the Flat Earth Society, published in Craft Horizons in October of 1976, she wrote, quote, "The work of art is alleged to be produced without the exercise of the artist's will and even unmodified by knowledge itself. The artists can't help it, or doesn't know how it happened, or whence came the inspiration. Should the artist try to analyze, control, even to think peripherally about the creative moment, it may be vitiated or even destroyed," unquote. The cost of such stereotypes were quite real. As Wayne explained in writing, these views predisposed artists to indignities and economic hardship, and one of Wayne's lifetime crusades was to dispel these myths. Thus, the seminars Wayne began in 1972 to teach women to succeed as professional artists through business savvy and real working knowledge of the art market and its politics. Part 3, creating intellectual art against the current. In the early 1950s, at the time June Wayne moved from oil painting to working in the medium of lithography as her primary endeavor, as she described it, lithography was, quote, irrelevant to the then dominant aesthetic of abstract expressionism. and artist lithographers, she said, quote, were consigned to an aesthetic limbo by critics, curators, and even by fellow artists, which she wrote in Print Quarterly years later in 1997. Nonetheless, Wayne began to work in lithography in part because she fell in love with the sensual qualities of the medium, her hands' contact with the delicate pores of the stone that were responsive to each subtlety inflected in her lines. Wayne started to create images relating to John Donne's poetry while listening to recordings of them. Not only hearing the voice, not only hearing the voice of the English actor Christopher Hassel, but the music and performance of it, as well as, quote, that marvelous combination of courtly and vernacular language, quote, moved her to make images to match the poems. Initially, she took lines from his poetry for titles of her prints, which she had traveled to make in Paris in 1958 with the master printer Marcel Duracier. Her critical assessment of these initial prints was that they were not tied closely enough to the entirety of the poems. Wayne said, quote, I realized that it was sort of cowardly to take lines from his poetry from my titles because I could have used any title. I could have said, quote, Love on the Beach in Santa Monica. And who would know the difference? I felt that Donne should be faced squarely. I had derived energy from him, and now I was proposing that I really engage the text and make a suite for which the particular text is responsible for what I've done in the print. I wanted to prove that even though there were hundreds of years between us, there was a collaboration between me and John Donne. So she began a livre d'artiste that ultimately included 15 lithographs, each one on a full-size sheet and opposite a page with only the poem's text. One of the significant achievements was that Wayne's lithographs for John Donne's poetry refused to prioritize the poetry over the visual and vice versa. In fact, Wayne's lithographs mirror Donne's attention not only to the subjective, but specifically to the perspective or viewpoint of a speaker. The perspective of the individual had entirely shifted during Donne's lifetime as the result of the so-called Copernican revolution in the 16th century. Scientists demonstrated that the geocentric theory of the cosmos was incorrect. The sun had usurped the position of the Earth as the center of the universe. Donne scholar Helen Brooks has observed that in both Donne's poetry and Wayne's imagery for the songs and sonnets, both turn inward because truth has become relative to the perspective of the individual observer. Donne's poems innovate through the use of monologue and give presence to the speaker, as in Break of Day. "'Tis true, 'tis day, what though it be? O wilt thou therefore rise from me? Why should we rise, because 'tis light? Did we lie down because 'twas night? Love, which in spite of darkness brought us hither, should, in despite of light, keep us together." We see in Wayne's lithograph, Break of Day, a man and a woman nestled together in a womb-like cave, neither of them rising to leave for the business, as Donne indicates in the third and last stanza of the poem, "Must business thee from hence remove." However, as I've just read to you in the poem, daylight is breaking, but we only see a dark or eclipsed sun. Thus, rather than a literal illustration, Wayne presents the moment from the perspective of the woman, who feels that although the night maybe have brought them together in bed, that love should keep them together despite the light. Wayne's lithograph for Break of Day, which is in black and white, as she was working with mostly monochrome materials at the time, has a dreamlike quality in the darkness that conceals the details and clarity of form which we would apprehend normally in daylight. Each lover's body is enmeshed with the other, giving each one a presence through the other one, but not existing on a familiar plane, as the two are cradled as a pair in what could be the walls of a cave or just as easily the palm of a gargantuan hand or a womb. The enmeshment of their bodies indicates carnal desires and spiritual connectedness of their souls. And Wayne's captivation by the images was in part because, as she put it, quote, the sentiment was so physical, unquote. And here I draw from John Donne's scholar Helen Brooks, who explains that metaphysicals poets such as John Donne sought the words to express states of mind and feeling. So bound to close attention to the language of Donne's poems and also to its affect, the lithographs for Wayne's Livre d'Artiste for songs and sonnets harmonize with their mood and affect on the reader. Something about their mystical qualities, they fall between the logic of science and the empiricism of feeling. Part 4, art, science, and language. In contrast to the myth of artists creating not out of free will, but through some innate drive that seizes them to be an instrument through which art is made, Wayne recognized that her own observations of the creative process were explained by the hard data and research of scientists. Wayne argued that the creativity and the creative process were inadequate terms that could be replaced by terms derived from anatomy, chemistry, physics, and molecular biology, things that revealed the brain's connections and explained how we receive, experience, store, and retrieve all information, whether verbal or sensory. In Artist as Scientist in a Reflective Universe, a process of discovery, Hirsch explains, quote, the artist brings abstraction into form, while the scientist brings form into abstraction, unquote. Thus, in her own practice, Hirsch saw herself within a continuum. In her extended sojourns in nature in the 1980s, Hirsch began to notice recurring patterns in nature, leading to her to conclude that there was no randomness in natural pattern. After this, she started to find letters everywhere in nature, eventually concluding that the alphabet originates in natural patterns. Furthermore, Hirsch recognized that many of these natural recurring patterns bore a resemblance to the structure of the neural networks in the brain. So these are the 5 major forms that she found in nature recurring and that she also found in the alphabets. These are notes for her ultimately what became a film that she narrates called Cosmography, The Writing of the Universe, which is a film where she explains and visually demonstrates these theories. And she recounts in this the process of recognition of these forms. In her voice-over narration, she says, quote, I conjectured that as early man and woman roamed the landscape looking for food or foe, they were repeatedly struck by certain patterns in nature that they eventually used as alphabetic morphology. I hypothesized at the time that ancient humans recognized these shapes because they mirrored the shapes of the neurons and neural processes of perception and cognition, unquote. One of these repeating patterns was the crossing of 2 lines, whether they were sticks, roots, or the blades of grass. She started to see the Hebrew alphabet in these, and also other alphabets, as she grew up in Montreal and was basically fluent in 4 languages at a very young age and writing poetry in all of those languages as well. The other letter that she saw in these crossed sticks in English was the X. This crossing of strands, which she saw across several forms used in cultures, suggesting that despite the differences in cultures, the physiology of perception is the same. And this is an illustration from her article more recently published on her theories of cosmography, showing you the optical chiasma, the refracted DNA molecule X-ray photograph, and the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, showing you these crossed forms. So as she saw these resemblances between the forms in nature and the forms of the morphology of the alphabet, she began to wonder whether, quote, we see because of what we think, or whether we think because of what we see. She said, there seemed to be a mirroring of the physiological structure of the perceptual apparatus, seen here in the crossing of the chiasma of the optical nerve and that which is perceived. The neural pathways of vision cross, and they seem to echo perceived external shapes. At the same time, this crossing pattern also mirrored the helical movement of the two crossing strands of the DNA molecule. A car accident in 1999 left her in critical condition, and Hirsch was told that if she'd survived, she'd never return to regular activities. In her paintings, she started to integrate the form and structure of the alphabet and language into a sensory visualization of her inner states, body, and mind. She began to heal her own body through painting, quote, reconstructing the body from the inside out, unquote, in a series of paintings called the Diamond Series, from which this is taken. White balls that you see in here appeared and had to do with the presence of calcium and also Tibetan Buddhist practices of compassion, which she had studied with the Dalai Lama in Tibet, which were visualized actually as a white orb, which is also the same form of calcium, this white kind of form. And that form is as well necessary to the healing and was necessary to the healing of her body. So she was able to heal her body through her art and from the inside out, which we see in this diamond painting, Who Will Live and Who Will Die, where we see this rib crate structure that she's literally painting her insides out and healing them. And we see these balls of compassion and calcium and all other kind of organic materials that she's working out and correcting in a sense that we were talking about, or that Erika was talking about, correcting the through Joseph Cornell's works, the kind of corrections that he made through his art. In conclusion, June Wayne, in her essay, The Male Artist is Stereotypical, actually confronts the notion of properly held notion of artists by someone such as Carl Jung, who said, quote, art is a kind of innate drive that seizes a human being and makes him its instrument. And in that sense, Wayne and Hirsch are distinct from Joan of Arc. Yes, Joan of Arc used her ability to communicate to gain her position, but this communication was founded on the authority of saintly visions. June Wayne and Gilah Hirsch never claimed that the source of their creativity was otherworldly or biologically driven, and instead they embraced their intellectual capacity and got down to work. So both Wayne and Hirsch counter the stereotype of the visual artist as someone without intellectual self-awareness, and I think as we're discovering or reinforcing with the papers at this conference, there is a wealth of intellectual and literary output by individuals who may be most known for the visual production. Thank you.
And our last speaker is Yulia Klymchuk, who is a doctoral candidate at Boris Grynchenko Kiev University. And she's working and researching across American, virtually unpronounceable word, at least to me, dramaturgical discourse. Though it's a Greek word, translation of American plays, pragmatics, and art cinematography. And her title today is Images of Women Artists in Wendy, Wasserstein's Dramaturgical Discourse.
Yes, thank you. Yes, here's my title, and now I'm going to present my paper. Thank you. Who is Wendy Wasserstein? Wendy Wasserstein is a famous figure in US drama, was known as an artist and social commentator during her lifetime. Wendy Wasserstein was the first woman in history who won a Pulitzer Prize as the author of the original play in 1989. In 2001, Harper's Bazaar article on a new generation of women playwrights, and the first sentence at this title was, quote, when you think on female playwrights, two words invariably come to mind, Wendy Wasserstein. Feminist Sally Burke writes that the feminist playwrights who began their work in 1970s. Even those who won Obie Awards were virtually ignored except by scholars of feminist drama. Even this list, of course, includes Wendy Wasserstein, but she is one of the most important playwrights in our time, especially in America, of course, and her work lacks the critical and scholarly attention that it deserves. Thus, she's regarded as leading playwright. Her plays represent many of the center ideas in American society. Since the Pulitzer Prize for Drama is one of the most prestigious prizes for dramatic art in America, its recipients can be seen as the superlative practitioners and exemplars of contemporary American drama, which mirrors various social phenomena in America today. One of Wendy Wasserstein's acclaimed play, The Heidi Chronicles, was awarded, as I said, the Pulitzer Prize in 1989, and Gail Austin made the following comments as for this, quote, "The Heidi Chronicles is a rare play for Broadway. Written by a woman, its central character is an unmarried professional woman." As Austin points out, Wasserstein's plays can be considered, at least in part, a triumph of women. Since her plays pay attention to women's life, which at one point were dominated by an oppressive mechanisms of male-dominated American society, formerly invisible, but now visible. By centering on women's points of view within her plays, Wasserstein questions and challenges the traditional views of women that society has taken for granted. Although she prefers being called a humanist, Wendy Wasserstein is, quote, "a feminist here, a significant spokeswoman for the social good and a major role model of women in the arts." In the arts. She uses much political feminist rhetoric in her plays, and mainly deals with feminist themes. Many female characters of Wasserstein's plays, viewed as her alter egos, stand against forces or burdens that oppress women's life. I'm going to show how this playwright constructed images of women artists in her famous Heidi Chronicles. The existing body of criticism on Wendy Wasserstein's play, The Heidi Chronicles, largely ignores the significance of female artists and paintings. Heidi Holland, the main hero of this play, names in the prologues that begin both acts of the play. Likewise, critics only briefly address Heidi's profession as an art historian, giving little thought to the meaning of her career choice. Recent feminist interpretations of Wasserstein's plays dismiss the significance of Heidi's profession as an art historian, because, as critics say, her profession and intellectual achievements also, quote, "are of minor importance and have little or no effect on her or anyone's life, of anyone else's life." Professor of English, Jan Belekian from Cornell University, sees Heidi's profession as typifying the traditional woman, detached from the action, but informed about it. And Charlotte Canning, also one of the researchers of her biography, interprets Heidi's tone during her art lectures are not very respectful, trivializing the historical differences between the paintings and the current moment. Many feminist critics many feminist critics look upon Heidi's character in general. Helen Kisser sees Heidi as a self-pitying woman, silenced by voices of men, and many critics accuse Heidi of selling out by adopting a baby at the end of the play. These negative portraits of Heidi's profession result from critics ignoring the remarkable creativity and passion that artists exhibit through their work. In Heidi Chronicles, the female artist Heidi incorporates into her lectures, producing paintings that preserve the artist's identities and creative visions. Heidi informs her class on the marginalization of female artists and uses her position as an art historian and instructor to bring the past into present, reviving female artists at her lecture. A close analysis of the female artists and paintings that Heidi incorporates into her lectures reveals that the female artists named in the Heidi Chronicles served as representations of women finding their own voices and authority within themselves through the creative outlet of painting. The Chronicles begins with Heidi delivering an art history lecture to her students at Columbia University in New York City in the same year, as I said, 1989. Although Heidi's profession and place of employment may not seem immediately significant, these details are crucial to an appreciation of how the play strongly represents and supports feminist values. Heidi serves as a proponent of the 1980s crusades for more women in the arts, and in her classroom she contributes to celebration of three forgotten female artists such as Claire Peters, Lily Martin Spencer, and Lila Cabot Perry. The first forgotten female artist, as you see, it's Claire Peters. What Heidi says about her, quote, Claire Peters, whose undated self-portrait we see here, was, I believe, the greatest woman artist. Peters' work predates the great period of still life painting. In her breakfast paintings, Claire's term, not mine, she used more geometry and less detail than her male peers. Notice here the cylindrical silver canister, the disc of the plate, and the triangular cuts of the cheese. Heidi refers to Peters as the greatest woman artist, more likely due to Peters' reputation for significantly affecting the development of still life painting. The painting by Peters to which Heidi refers, her self-portrait and her breakfast paintings, serves as testimonies to her artistic skill and desire to preserve her identity through the paintings. In a self-portrait, Peters sits at a dressing table decorated with flowers, elegant gold adornments, and gold and silver coins. Clearly, veils and statues comprise an important part of her identity. Peters herself, elegantly dressed and adorned with jewelry, holds a compact mirror in her hand. However, she does not look in the mirror, but rather she looks away from the mirror and the viewer towards the side. In lecturing to the class about Peters and her work, Heidi stresses female superiority and artistic skill. Heidi draws the attention to her class to the important elements in Peters' breakfast paintings. Also, in the lecture of Heidi, she pays attention on Peters and her work and again incorporates comments that another also woman artist, Charlotte Canning, interprets, quote, jocular and overly familiar. Heidi wants her class to understand the elements that comprise the painting, and it is her job as an instructor to convey this information to the class. By making these comments, Heidi also incorporates a bit of humor into her lecture in order to establish a personal connection with Peters. Heidi wants to connect with Peters as a struggling, marginalized woman by viewing and studying her paintings. Heidi also uses humor in her lectures as a means of developing her identity as an art historian and instructor. Also, she wants to convey information about the artist and paintings to her class. She does not want to lecture the class in an impersonal manner. These humorous and seemingly flippant comments are Heidi's way of revealing her own voices and personality to her students. The next female is Lily Martin Spencer, and at class Heidi says, quote, "A leap but go with me, we both must fade," painted in 1869, which the American genre painter Lily Martin Spencer combines in a Vanitas painting the formal portrait of Sophonisba, another artist, and the still life composition of Peters. We have a young woman posing in detailed dress surrounded by symbolic still life objects. The fading flower and the timepiece are both reminders of mortality and time passing, while the precocious generally spilling out is an allusion to the transience of earthly possessions. This portrait can be perceived as a meditation on the brevity of youth, beauty, and life, but what can't? Spencer represents an unconventional yet successful female professional, one of the most prominent female artists of the mid-19th century. She didn't receive artistic training from a family member as he did female artists on her time. Rather, she sought educational and artistic opportunities in Cincinnati. Once she became a successful artist, Spencer challenged an expectant female role by providing financial support for her husband and children. If I'm not mistaken, she had 13 children. Yes, throughout her career as a professional painter. In Spencer painting, We Both Must Fade, a woman wearing an elegant blue dress stands alone in a dimly lit room. She looks away from the viewer of the painting as outdoor light from a window illuminates her face. She holds a wilted pink rose in her hand, and an open box and a vase of flowers stands on a nearby table. While one may easily overlook the object on the table and wilted rose, Heidi makes sure to point out the significance of those objects in Spencer's paintings. Heidi identifies Spencer's work as a Vanitas painting, and in traditional painting, beautiful fruits and flowers, decay and wilt, symbolizing the transient nature of life. Despite the woman's elegant clothing and jewelry, her life too will fade. She will not remain beautiful forever, and all the material possessions in the world cannot keep her from fading. As Heidi looks at Spencer's painting, she remembers her experience at a high school dance, and she says to her class, quote, "Frankly, this painting has always reminded me of me at one of those horrible high school dances. And you sort of want to dance, and you sort of want to go home, and you sort of don't know what you want. So you hang around a fading rose in a detailed dress, waiting to see what might happen." When Heidi tells her students that Spencer's painting reminds her of a horrible high school dance, she remembers her own high school in 1965 quite vividly. The preoccupation with boys, dates, and dancing that accompanies these high school activities remains fresh in Heidi's memory. She remembers being a young girl experiences the pressures of conformity, and Heidi connects with the woman in Spencer's painting as a fellow high school dance survivor. Heidi's experience in life makes her the woman she is today, and part of becoming a woman and developing her own identity means experiencing uncomfortable situations. In the sense that follows this prologue to the first act, the reader meets a young Heidi who announces her inspiration to become an art historian and develops an interest in reviving forgotten female artists. When Heidi firstly tells her friend Scoop Rosenbaum that she plans to be an art historian, Scoop responds, quote from a play, "Please don't say that, that is really suburban." Scoop clearly sees Heidi's choice of profession as snobbish, but most of all she implies that it is not a proper profession for women. However, Heidi does not allow Scoop's comments to discourage her. In response to Scoop, Heidi says, "I'm interested in the individual expression of the human soul, content over form." In the prologue of the second act, Heidi is back to the lecture hall, introducing the last forgotten female artist to her student. It's Lila Cabot Perry. And I quote her what Heidi says about her. "The painting I prefer is Lady in Evening Dress, painted in 1911. Closer to her mentor Monet, Lila is willing to lose her edges in favor of paint and light. Go, Lila. Now let's compare for a moment Cabot's Lila with Lily Martin Spencer's Fading Rose. There is something unique female about these paintings, and I am not referring to their lovely quantities, delicate techniques, or overall charm. Oh, please, what strikes me is both ladies seem slightly removed from the occasions at hand. They appear to watch closely, and is the way for others to join it. I suppose it's really not unlike being an art historian. In other words, being neither the painter nor the casual observer, but a highly informed spectator. Heidi prefers Paris Lady in the Evening Dress to Lady with a bowl of violets, because Perry paints the woman in the evening dress without using bold, harsh lines. Instead, the paint itself seems to create the flow of the woman's dress, and Perry illuminates the woman's face through the color choices and paintbrush strokes. Heidi cheers Perry in her artistic success, explaining, "Go, Lila." Just as Heidi refers Claire Peters by her first name. And to make a conclusion, as an art historian, Heidi revives forgotten female artists, and in doing so gives these artists voices. The artists speak through their paintings, conveying messages about their own struggle for recognition and inclusion in male-dominating society. Heidi facilitates the spread of the artist's messages through her art history lectures, and she takes on an authoritative role in imparting for her own knowledge about art history to her students. Thank you for attention.
I think we can't, I don't know where Edyta is, but we can't take 10 minutes for questions because we run late in any case. So, any questions, observations?
Thank you very much for the last paper by Yulia. I'm interested in how Heidi never talks about being an art historian herself, or the hardship of being a woman in this profession. She talks about the recovery of these women artists, but does she ever talk about what it's like to be a woman at Columbia University in the Department of Art History? Does she talk about that in the play?
Recently I have read this play, like the second to the third time. Recently I have read this play maybe the third time, and she said that she wanted to be an art historian, and her friends rejected her, but she became, yes, and she became very successful in her career, and after that even she achieved her dream, adopt a child. So she wanted to be art historian, and she was. No, yeah, no, of course. She wrote thesis, she worked hard, and after that, of course, she became.
It's a question for Iryna. Thank you for your lovely paper. And I haven't seen these cartoons of Flannery O'Connor before, and they're very illuminating. And I wonder if you'd say more, because you also brought up her Christianity and how important that is to her writing. And the thing with the cartoons, they're such a caricature. They really, they really just shut down this one moment of grotesquerie. And I was wondering, in her stories, because they're longer narrative form, is there space for the grotesque to move towards redemption or some kind of grace? Because Flannery O'Connor, it's hard to see grace. It's hard to see redemption or some kind of movement towards the betterment of humanity or the characters that she's addressing.
Well, the first thing I like to mention is that the caricatures were performed during her college years, and actually she completed her caricaturing career at 1945. So probably as quite a young girl, she couldn't just bring up such important topics, actually, maybe she was not even going to bring up Christianity to put it into her cartoons, but certainly there is wider scope of topics, and among of them Christianity takes the major part of her fiction writing. And that is why I wanted to emphasize that her cartooning experiments or her cartooning practices were just like the base for her further experiments in fiction. And actually she just used the tool of cartooning to maybe facilitate this grotesquerie in her further works. But actually we just can't overlook all these beautiful attempts, all these graphic works, because just if you start reading Flannery O'Connor being completely ignorant of her cartooning experiments, you can just maybe not misinterpret, but something will lack in your interpretation. But if you start reading Flannery O'Connor, having in mind that she was primarily a cartoonist, so then there will be just like additional dimension to the interpretation of your fiction. Thank you for the question.
It seems then, if I might add, that you said her cartoons were just published in like 2011 but they weren't. It doesn't sound like they were published alongside her texts, or were they?
Actually, she tried to publish the cartoons in a very high culture or highbrow culture issue, the New Yorker, but they rejected publishing the cartoons. It was in 1944, and then she stopped just persisting, and it was just the first edition in the year 2011, when all the cartoons were collected and published in one book. There is a preface, and actually, there is some focus on her graphic techniques, and it's a valuable book because it just gives the readers and the fans of Flannery O'Connor to look at her as a cartoonist primarily.
Just maybe one question for Carolyn and Daniela, who's skillfully hiding again, just, whether, you see a connection with from your organic iconography, which of the two I can't remember, whether you see any connections with, the Surrealist women artists and their use of anatomy, organicity, just like.
That is a very interesting question. It's not, I hadn't equated them. Just off the top of my head, it's interesting because June Wayne's earlier work was very much ensconced in surrealist style. Now for Gilah, Yelin, Hirsch, that never was part of her visual vocabulary, but I think that propensity for the organic representation in women's art, certainly we've all seen it in the literature of Georgia O'Keeffe and so forth, whether that's gender specific, I don't know, certainly the motivations between the organicism in the work of healing through Hirsch's paintings is certainly a different endpoint than what that sort of self-realization more on probably on a creative, spiritual self-identity role that it seems to me the surrealist women are trying to accomplish.
I don't have anything to add to what was said.
I just thought you could make one sentence about Tamarind Press for people who are not familiar with it.
Terrific. I'm wondering if Stella is still here, who probably experienced it a little bit more. But yes, a very. I'm actually making a political statement in certain respects by not focusing on that aspect of her career, especially bringing it to an audience. She's certainly more well known within the Los Angeles area, and then also within the printing circles of people who are interested in printing, which is a select few. But it was a hugely important institution because as she started to get involved in printmaking, she realized that the art of printmaking had really been lost in the United States. There were no masters at printing. There were some artists working with some printmakers on a very limited basis. So the goal was to train them in these skills and to revive it. And indeed it did. It was in the 10-year period, as she kept on refunding it with Ford Foundation, quite a number of other of the master printers who were trained out of there went off and started their own institutions like GI, Gemini, and other ones that people are probably more familiar with. So, but it had largely died out as an art form. And it's kind of amazing because now one of the places that I'm teaching, Cal State Polytechnic in Pomona actually has a printmaking program in their art department, which I doubt there would have been had it not been for this revival of interest and training.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think we need to thank our speakers and, go for lunch in anticipation of the artists from A to Z. So please join me to thank our speakers.